Perfect. So, merci, Jean-Francois. Apologies that, again, that I don't speak French. I wish I could speak fluently, but unfortunately not yet. So hopefully soon I will be able. Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, good, thank you. So as Jean-Francois was mentioning, what I will be trying to introduce now briefly, even if there are many images, so apologies also if I go very quickly through many things. We can have a conversation at the end. It's basically an insight into the design studio that I lead in Newcastle upon Tyne, in Newcastle University, which is called Building Upon Building. And it's a studio in which we explore architecture within a cultural continuum. So we are interested in looking at historical buildings, very often buildings that are preserved or buildings that have a very clear heritage or cultural value, usually by great architects. And we look at them doing a lot of research. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, doing a lot of research and then trying to find alternative ways of preserving those buildings. So we are interested in exploring those buildings in terms of experimental preservation, which is not just like applying like the current regulations that apply to a building, but trying to find the contradictions, the challenges, and trying to find different ways of proposing things that might be a bit strange or different to the usual practice. So in this way, you must understand this studio as something that it's quite, I will look at that time just to make sure that I keep roughly within time. So you need to understand that this is quite a conceptual studio. So the proposals are not that much to be built tomorrow, but are rather to challenge our understanding of certain things and certain ideas. But as you will see, everything is based in a quite thorough research and quite a careful discussion. Actually, I will first introduce briefly the studio so that you can understand, as my colleagues did in the previous session, which was very interesting because they were showing the way that they were working. I will do that as well very briefly, and then I will show a few projects. So these are basically some of the editions of the studio that we have run in the past, and 2 studios that I'm running now simultaneously, both in Newcastle and in Milan. And you see, or you can recognize, for example, Patrick Geddes and the Outlook Tower, Inigo Jones and the Queen's House, or Lubetkin and the Penguin Pond, or maybe you have even seen the studios in around Johnstone, because actually one of our best students was awarded the President Medal by the RIBA, by the Royal Institute of British Architects, with that project that was imagining an extension of Sir Johnstone House and Museum. Therefore, within this interest, the event of the fire in 2019 suddenly drew our attention, and we thought, or I thought, that it would be very interesting to run one of these studios around the figure of Viollet-le-Duc and Notre-Dame, trying to again challenge this idea, this contemporary idea of preservation and the way that we deal with this heritage from the past. So in many ways, many of the questions that were brought to the debate and to the floor yesterday by Richard Whitman about all this construction of the past, construction of the memory, the way that we relate with that, and tourism and the touristic exploitation of all these things, and the way that we deal with all that, it's somehow in the base of the studio. And then what as I was mentioning, the case of Notre-Dame was very was fitting very well, like the agenda of the studio. and specifically looking at the transformation by Viollet-le-Duc with the construction of the flesh, but also around the ideas of the ideal cathedral and the role that this cathedral should play in the city. So we were very interested, not that much in the flesh and all the works in the cathedral, but about understanding the way that the urban space around the cathedral can frame, can play in the framing of the cathedral, and therefore in the interpretation and the understanding of the cathedral itself. So this is why the studio was not trying to do any of this, because actually I'm sure that you have seen many of these. Maybe my favorite one is this one, this flesh, which is a rocket platform. So this is not what we do in the studio, just to make it clear. Also because when we started the studio, it was already decided that the flesh and the roof would be rebuilt as they were. So we thought that that was out of our discussion, because actually even in the public debate that was already over. But still the importance of the city in the framing of the cathedral and the interpretation was very important, and also the management of the construction site. So this is why in the studio, I proposed to the students to rethink the way that we preserve buildings and the way that we manage that preservation. And the only suggestion in the brief was that they could do whatever they wanted, but they must explain very carefully why they do what they do. And they were supposed to build a building that should be a typology to be defined by them, to host like a national center for heritage and preservation in France. So trying to foster that reflection in the students, to rethink, as I was mentioning before, how do we preserve buildings and what's our relation with buildings? And hence that term that I was using of experimental preservation, which might be something a bit shocking because it's mixing this idea of preserving something, which means that we don't touch it because something that we respect, but we actually experiment with it because it's what always happened. It's impossible to preserve anything without changing it. Because actually, even when we don't touch a building, when we just clean the building, just the cleaning is altering the building and its interpretation. So this is why the studio starts always with a first stage in which we do lots of research. So here you see, for example, how students were finding the changing moments in the history of the cathedral. They were mapping those, representing those in a series of plans, and trying to understand each one of these moments, and then analyze them in the plans, in the role of the cathedral in the city at each moment, but also in the imaginary and the images that we can somehow associate to that. So it's a lot of research. I'm going to pass very quickly because I don't think we have time for everything. So then the case of Notre-Dame is then discussed in detail through different historical maps in different historical moments, put into relation with other cases, also trying to look not just at historical documents, but also to look at what guidebooks and other popular materials say. Also finding funny things like, for example, this film from 2004, where there is this dialogue saying Notre-Dame will be gone one day. Well, not Notre-Dame, but the flesh or the spire for sure. And we didn't know that. And then also doing some historical mapping of finding all the buildings that were built at some time in the Ile de la Cité, but now they don't exist anymore. Some of them they exist. So they did this collection, putting also the parking and other ones, trying to understand like the different scales, the different typologies of all these buildings and how they were overlapping and how they were building like the area that we see nowadays and the landscape of the site that we see. Then the students must create an exhibition in the school building in which they somehow synthesize all that information and outcomes. They did a model as well. And then they did also a video that somehow explains and articulates all those ideas and findings. So these are some captions of the video in which they explain like their ideas, and not just about the case of Notre-Dame, but as I was mentioning before, also about how do we understand heritage and preservation nowadays in different approaches, and especially looking at all those intricate aspects that raise all the complexities and contradictions of the debates. So following that very intense research that it takes quite a long time, and the making of the model and so on, then we do what I call the grand tour, in which we always go to Italy and spend some time there analyzing buildings, and we visit good buildings from all history, but we also look at bad buildings, because I think that's a very good exercise, especially by some contemporary architects, because luckily many of the bad buildings from the past have been destroyed or transformed, but there are lots of bad buildings from nowadays that we can study in order to to learn how to try to avoid mistakes. And in that trip, in that grand tour, in a very British way, let's say, even if the studio is very international because there are students from all over the world, we did a stop in Paris. Oh, this is in Rome when we discussed things, but we did a stop in Paris and we met with Jean-Francois. So we had a seminar in this building that took one whole morning, in which the students were discussing with Jean-Francois. Jean-Francois gave a lecture about the Ile de la Cité and Notre-Dame and the history, and then the students were replicating to Jean-Francois' lecture with the video that I was mentioning, and then we had some conversation talking about the challenges of the area and so on. So then when we are back in Newcastle, then we start properly the studio, working with the models and working with all the ideas from the field trip, and then trying to look at proposals about how to create that building and how to occupy the parvis. But also some students were even thinking about reimagining the whole Ile de la Cité, so not just the parvis. Always with this idea about using the construction site of Notre-Dame as a sort of excuse to create this building that should rethink our relation with the heritage, and that somehow revives this confrontation between the past and our current challenge and debates. So these are some of the reviews, very similar to what our colleagues were proposing or were showing in the case of their studio, and for these reviews we get some colleagues, some of them from France, some others from other backgrounds, which is quite interesting in order to spark some interesting debates and different approaches. Of course, from France, Jean-Francois was very generous coming to Newcastle before the pandemic. And then the second review was done online. But then in the first review was very funny because we managed to photograph Jean-Francois as one of these masters with Notre-Dame and the cathedral, which we thought it was quite funny. Then, going into the projects by the students, some of the students were imagining this new building or this transformation of the Ile de la Cité through the occupation of the parvis or through building in the parvis. So there were many massing explorations at the beginning, and mostly these projects were more concerned with the massing exploration and not that much with the typology. So some of them, they were studying like the footprint of the different buildings that were once there and they don't exist anymore, and trying to find clues for the massings out of those footprints. Some others were thinking rather about the way that a new volume might frame the cathedral and might relate or might mediate the relations between the cathedral, the river banks, and the other buildings. So this is why you see how some buildings, they somehow respect the space of the parvis, but they somehow close that space as well. With some buildings, some others, they tend to occupy more the parvis, like trying to rebuild like even the former hotelier, but in trying to revive or to keep part of that memory. Some of them, they seem to try to evoke like the former street that was in front of Notre-Dame, that yesterday many of our colleagues, historians, were discussing in projects from 17th and 19th centuries, for example, like this one, but also trying to solve the relation with the crypt and the ruins and the riverbank as well. Sorry that I passed very quickly, but it's just to give you a sense about the breadth in the studio. And so you can see also that all the proposals are absolutely different. And some others, they are more grounded in the historical analysis to then propose, for example, this one, a building that it's somehow keeping a lot of the extension of the parvis, expanding on that idea of the pavement, but also framing a very precise and a small parvis, which is smaller in front of the cathedral. And some of these, as I was mentioning, they try to reflect about the way that these buildings frame the perception of the cathedral from above, but also from the riverbanks. And they also think about the change of this building through time and through day and night and so on. So there are lots of iterations, lots of sketches. Trying to explore like different proposals. Some of them that they were more with the idea of the axe, as in some of the classic proposals that mostly we were discussing yesterday. But some of them they tried to do more complex schemes. So here you see, some images about how the building also relates with the facades of Notre-Dame, because of course then the development of the project has to do not just with the urban level, but also with the constructive level. So you see how some of those facades, they are designed and developed in relation with the elevations of Notre-Dame and the buildings around. Therefore, the dimensioning, the modules of those facades and so on, try to build on that discussion. Some other students might choose to do something a bit more postmodern, we could say, as a starting point. Then they start to realize about the problems of that. And then the building or the mass then becomes like sort of contemporary tower that it's placed in front of Notre-Dame, creating this tension between this new tower and the towers of Notre-Dame. For example, this proposal that you see, and some others, they try to build a parvis, trying to somehow evoke all the memory of that layering that was that we find in history, and all that stratification that we were discussing yesterday mostly. And actually, they look at some precedents also from the 1960s, 70s, like for example, this project about trying to find inspiration about how to occupy quite massively the parvis. And those buildings, are some of these that you see. And of course, there is always this attention to the materiality and the tectonic of the building, which is something that now I'm not going to go in because I'm just concerned about time. So some other projects try to be a bit more ambitious, rethinking the Viollet de la Cité, and also in relation with the management of the construction site. So you see, for example, this project by Ruben, in which he was very interested in the idea of the scaffolding and all the image of the scaffoldings around around Notre-Dame for, of course, carrying out the restoration. And he was proposing basically to build even a bigger scaffolding that would be almost a permanent scaffolding that would occupy the Part B, but also the gardens at the back of the cathedral in a project that would echo also some of the details you might remember in the Pompidou, for example. And actually, that huge scaffolding would somehow integrate the scaffolding of the construction site into the new building, allowing visitors to visit the construction site. Little bit almost like in the Sagrada Familia, let's say, where you can visit the building as the construction work in that case is going on. And of course, then there is all this problem about how to design a building that it's like a scaffolding, and how that building then relates with all the archaeological remains under the Part B, and therefore all that is discussed in quite a good detail, also in atmospheric views, understanding how the space in the Part B would be, how the framing and the view of the cathedral from that scaffolding building would be, how that would relate with the building. Then what the relation of the dimensioning of the scaffolding would be in relation with the cathedral, and then of course developing the constructive detail and so on. And then in the other part, that would be a sort of picturesque park that would relate to other projects as well. Therefore, creating, let's say, this sort of expanded construction site that would be a sort of live construction site open to visitors and to citizens. Other projects were actually trying to link more closely to all the discussions that we had yesterday with our colleagues, historians, about all these buildings that were imagining very, very, very unique views of the future of Paris, and how we could revisit those nowadays in the light of the current debates around Notre-Dame. And actually, there is this project that it's quite interesting by Oliver Gave, who was proposing basically to build a building that would be a machine inspired also by the case of the Gothic Quarter in Barcelona that I was presenting yesterday. If you remember, and there was a process of dismantling buildings in order to build new buildings. So basically, this building would be a sort of big machine that would be fed with the demolition of the buildings in the Ile de la Cité, and would convert the whole Ile de la Cité into a construction site that would reshape the whole Paris. So you see this aerial view that, of course, even in the modernity of the buildings, you see some relation with the historical debates about, again, the street in front of the facade of Notre-Dame, for example. So it would be this very industrial building with all these advertisements and almost a sort of dystopian touristic building. But as you will see, it's not just about this touristic exploitation in a very wild way, but it's actually proposing more interesting things. Like, for example, all these workshops, which is the machine line in which historical buildings are dismantled, and then they are rejoined to build new buildings. And this is why from these spaces that they mix shops and museums, you can see the construction line in the basement. And this is why the facades, they are these big screens in which you can project advertisements, but you can project also the buildings that were once there and doesn't exist anymore. So somehow, at some moments, you can feel this very touristic space, but somehow you can do a sort of virtual reality in which you experience how was the city from medieval times. So, for example, you could have this vision of this view of the street of the street in front of Notre-Dame, with a projection of the buildings that now doesn't exist anymore, or at least for a few minutes or hours, you could experience that. So this is why it's this idea of dismantling the Ile de la Cité to build something new. And you see how in the new buildings, then all parts of the existing buildings that are dismantled, then they are reintegrated with modern materials. And as I was mentioning, all this is then developed in quite a lot of detail. Here you see in the section all the construction line, and then in those images, that then they plan even the future of that reshaping of Paris in a sort of sequence that tried to build in a sort of quite radical continuity with the proposals that we were discussing yesterday. So there is even Paris in 2100. And it's that image that probably you have seen that Jean-François loves as an introduction to these 2 days of exciting discussions. Of course, all that then it's accompanied by some management about how the building is run in terms of tourism, advertisements, and things like that. And then there are even other proposals that they try to do a more poetic experimental preservation, for example, of the roof, understanding this expression about how do you say it in French, like the forest, la forêt. And then they try to propose to transform the whole Ile de la Cité into a forest by literally converting everything into a garden around the cathedral, trying to evoke that forest that was in the roof and that doesn't exist anymore, and then making this building that it's something that it's very transparent and wants to almost disappear. So merci. So this is just an insight.